The wind carried dust through the open square, kicking up skirts and rustling the canvas roofs of merchant stalls. The sun, low and tired, bled orange across the dry horizon. In the center of it all, tied to a wooden post like a warning or a forgotten item, stood Eleanor Rose. Her father's voice cut through the murmuring crowd, sharp and deliberate. She is barren, folks. Can't bear a child to save her life. But she can sew. She can cook. And she does not talk back. Half the price of a breeding cow. Please, Papa, Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. Her wrists were chafed raw where the rope bit into her skin. Her cheeks, sunburned and stained with dried tears, flushed again with humiliation. Shut your mouth, her father snapped. Be grateful I am selling you where men can look you in the eye instead of tossing you to the pigs. A few people chuckled. Most just looked away. Eleanor had once stood at the altar of St. John's Chapel, her hands trembling not from fear, but from hope. Her wedding dress had been hand-sewn by her mother. Her groom, the eldest son of a wealthy cattle baron, had looked at her like a prize calf. Their marriage had been arranged as a blessing for both families. She had been told she was chosen. For 2 years she drank bitter roots, prescribed by the midwife, counted days with trembling fingers, and prayed so hard her knees ached. But her womb never stirred. No blood turned blue, no swell of belly, no infant cries in the cold cabin air. Her mother-in-law had been the first to speak what others only whispered. She is decoration, a useless flower. Let us not waste spring on snow soil. Her husband stopped looking her in the eye, stopped speaking at all. Then one evening he rode home with a new girl, barely 16. With quick eyes and a smile like vinegar, he handed Eleanor a letter, unsigned, cold. She will give me 5 sons, God willing, he said, not looking at her. You cannot. They packed her things, what little she had, and left them by the door. She was not allowed to stay until sunrise. The girl had taken her room, her pillow, her place at the table. Eleanor walked 5 miles through dust and shame to reach her father's house. Her mother had passed years ago. Her father opened the door, looked at her face, and frowned. You should have kept your womb working. That was your only job. She slept in the barn that night. By morning, he had made up his mind. There were mouths to feed, debts to settle. A daughter who could not bear heirs was a burden less than a mule, less than milk. So now she stood in the middle of the market square, the rope around her wrists biting deeper every time she shifted to keep balance. Her dress, once white and stitched with hope, was torn and dust-stained. Anyone? Her father called out again, voice laced with frustration. 22 years old. Still got all her teeth, just faulty inside. The crowd murmured. A boy pointed and laughed. A woman shook her head. Eleanor stared ahead, eyes glassy. She did not cry. She could not. There was nothing left to squeeze from her. Her pride had been stripped in layers at the doorstep of her husband, in the barn of her father, and now in front of strangers who would rather barter for chickens. The wind picked up again. It smelled of manure and rust and old hay, but Eleanor only smelled ash. Somewhere a bell rang for supper. Somewhere else a child was born to someone. Not her. She closed her eyes. The world did not stop, even as she was breaking, and still no one stepped forward. Cross Creek Border Market. Moments later, the laughter died first, then the murmurs faded, swallowed by the hush that fell like a curtain across the square. Dust settled midair as hooves struck earth, slow, deliberate, and far too quiet for a group that large. Heads turned, conversations halted mid-sentence. A child dropped a stick of licorice from the edge of the market. They appeared like ghosts stepping from the trees. A small band of Comanche riders, their horses lean and dust-streaked. From the trail, no one spoke, but the tension thickened like a storm about to break. At the front rode a man with shoulders broad as a barn beam, his chest bare beneath a faded deerskin vest. His hair, long and black, was tied neatly behind his head with a strip of red cloth. His face, weathered and solemn, held no anger, only weariness carved into the lines around his mouth and the shadow beneath his dark eyes. He was not alone. Behind him, 5 children rode single file on smaller ponies, some clinging to the reins, others to one another. The oldest, a boy of 10, held his chin high. Though his eyes darted with alertness, a girl about 8 rode beside him, silent, her face half hidden behind a shawl. The others were younger, their clothes mismatched and travel-stained. The smallest, a girl no older than 3, sat in front of her brother, clutching a corn-husk doll. No one in town moved. The man dismounted. Dust clung to his boots, the bottom of his leggings soaked in creek mud. He walked without hesitation toward the wooden table where Eleanor's father still stood, arms crossed, jaw tight with suspicion. Eleanor, bound at the post, blinked slowly. Her lips were cracked, her vision blurred, and yet when she saw the man, the stranger from the forest, flanked by weary children and silence, something deep inside her stirred. Not hope, not yet, but something less hollow than before. The man reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. From it he drew a simple silver necklace, unpolished but unmistakably handmade. A name was etched into the back. In careful strokes, Neva. He placed it gently on the table. "I will take her," he said in low, accented English. His voice was like old cedar, rough but full of heat. "Not as a wife, as a soul that should not be chained." Eleanor's father frowned, scoffing. "What if she's no good for you either? You want a refund later?" The man's eyes did not waver. He tilted his head slightly, studying Eleanor for the first time. Not her body, not her age, not her shame, just her. As if he saw something others had missed. "She's not a thing," he said simply. "I do not buy to own. I buy to free." The father hesitated, but the silver caught his eye. His hand hovered greedily, then closed around the necklace. "Your problem now." No one else moved. The square held its breath. Eleanor's throat tightened. Her knees buckled slightly. The rope was cut. She barely felt it. Her feet refused to move at first, too used to standing still. Her hands trembled. He did not reach for her. He did not speak to her. He just turned and began to walk. She looked to the dust where the necklace had lain. She looked at the man's back, broad and steady, the 5 children waiting beyond him, like shadows of a life she could not imagine. And she stepped forward, not because she trusted him, not because she believed in second chances, but because he had looked at her and seen someone worth unchaining. Her father said nothing as she passed. The crowd had already begun to lose interest. But Eleanor, barefoot and bruised, followed the stranger out of the square toward the edge of the world. And for the first time in months, she was not being dragged. The ride was long and quiet, the kind that settled into the bones. Eleanor sat stiffly in the mule cart, her hands clasped, the wooden slats pressing against her back with each jolt. The children followed behind on small ponies, silent and watchful, their eyes wide but unreadable. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, the sun had vanished behind the ridge, leaving a streak of rose over the trees. Pines rose thick and ancient, casting long shadows as a nearby creek whispered under stone. The land felt different, not soft, but steady, not cruel, but uncompromising. To led her through a clearing where a single lodge stood, built of pine, logs and hide, its roof patched with care. Smoke spiraled thin from the chimney. A windchime made of bone and beads swayed lazily above the doorway. This was her space, he said, nodding toward the entrance. He did not explain who her was. He did not need to. Eleanor stepped inside and stopped. The air smelled of cedar, faint lavender and ash. The room was small, a cot in the corner, a fire pit, a rolled mat, no mirrors, no dresses. But the walls were marked with carvings and etchings, symbols and patterns that told stories of someone else's hands, someone else's life. 5 children stood just outside, peering in. The eldest boy stood still, arms crossed. The second glanced at her and looked away. The girl clutched her brother's sleeve, and the youngest twins, barely past toddlerhood, clung to each other, their expressions wary. No one spoke. To knelt near the fire and added a log. "This is Eleanor," he said simply. "She stays here now." He looked at the children, not asking, only informing. Then he turned and left. Eleanor sat on the cot, unsure what to do. No one gave instructions. No one asked anything of her. She listened to footsteps outside, soft giggles, an owl calling in the dark. Her fingers ached. She stared at the pale line on her ring finger. now nearly gone. Asterisk. Sleep came late and shallow, broken by dreams of doors slamming, voices shouting, and children crying far from her reach. On the third night, she finally rose. The fire had burned low. The children were curled together near their hearth, small bodies warmed by each other. Eleanor moved instinctively, sorting leftover beans, drawing water from the well, lighting a fresh fire. Her hands worked without instruction, not for praise, just to feel useful. Then came a cough, sharp, wet, alarming. She turned. The youngest boy lay curled, his brow shining with sweat, breath ragged. She knelt, felt the heat radiating from his skin. Her chest tightened. No one stirred. She stood searching shelves until she found a cracked bowl, some dried herbs, a bundle tied with hide string. She did not know their names, but she had used similar ones before. She crushed them, added water, and placed the pot over the fire. The boil took forever. Her hands shook. When it cooled, she spooned it gently to the boy's lips. He coughed, but drank. She wiped his brow with a cloth. Her hands never stopped moving. Outside, she heard something shift, a soft rustle, then quiet. At the doorway, resting on the threshold, lay a green sprig tied with horsehair. Tu had not spoken, but he had seen no words, just the offering. By dawn, the fever had broken. The boy opened his eyes, blinked once, and fell back asleep. Later, the other children looked at her differently, not with full trust, not yet, but with something else, something quiet and new. And for now, that was enough. The days fell into rhythm, not soft, but steady. Eleanor woke with the sun and fed the fire before the chill left the air. She swept out the lodge with a branch broom, gathered herbs from the edges of the trees, and learned to boil corn until the smell reminded her of childhood and church days and something almost like comfort. The children did not speak much, but they watched everything, at first from a distance, then from doorways, then from just over her shoulder. Eleanor, unsure how to win affection when words still felt like bruises inside her mouth, turned instead to what she knew: quiet hands, steady tasks, small acts of care. She braided the girl's hair when it tangled into knots. She patched a rip in the older boy's tunic where the sleeve had frayed. She left berries by the twins' bedding, sour and red, but sweetened when dipped in honey. One afternoon, while gathering willow bark near the stream, she showed the 6-year-old girl how to fold wide leaves into little boats. The girl's brow furrowed in deep concentration, her tongue peeking out as she mirrored Eleanor's movements with careful fingers. When the leaf boat floated smoothly down the creek, and the girl smiled, really smiled, Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, something deep and sore and still alive. They began to follow her more closely after that. She told them stories, not grand ones, just simple tales passed down from her mother, stories of animals that spoke in riddles, of stars that fell in love with the moon, of a clever fox that once stole a wedding dress. The younger ones leaned in, eyes wide and sparkling. The oldest boy pretended not to listen, but she caught him once after dark, sitting near the goats, quietly repeating one of her stories to himself. Tu did not interfere. He came and went like the wind, quiet, always watching, always listening. Sometimes he brought home bundles of roots or strips of salted meat. Sometimes he brought silence. He never touched her, never asked anything of her, but he always nodded when he passed. And sometimes, just sometimes, she thought she saw the shadow of a smile tugging at the edge of his tired eyes. She did not know if that made it better or worse. Then came the stew. She had meant well, had tried to stretch the last of the root vegetables with beans and herbs, but the fire burned too hot, and the pot had been too full. A careless bump of her hip, and the whole thing crashed to the ground. Hot broth, soft beans, and tender roots splattered in every direction. The children froze, their bodies stiff. Eleanor stood above the mess, paralyzed. Her heart pounded. Already, she felt the memory of the slap, the scream, the sting of shame pressing in from all sides. It had happened before, back when she'd burned bread in her husband's house, back when she was less wife, more disappointment. Her hands trembled, her knees buckled. Then a voice, quiet and plain, broke through the panic. It is only stew. To's voice came from behind her, low and unruffled. She turned slowly. He knelt without expression, calmly scooping vegetables back into the pot. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. He did not look at her. He did not scold. "It can be made again," he added, wiping his hands on a cloth. "We all spill." Eleanor dropped to her knees beside him, helping to clean in silence, blinking hard. She did not cry, not then, not until later, when the children were asleep and she sat alone by the hearth, the faint scent of beans still clinging to the air. She thought of her wedding day, of her mother-in-law's twisted mouth whispering curses, of how many times she had apologized for being less than expected. And she thought of 5 pairs of eyes watching her now, not judging, just witnessing. That night, the youngest twin coughed. Eleanor stirred, reached for the damp cloth by the fire, and padded barefoot to the sleeping pile. She touched the child's brow, warm, but not alarming. Just a passing chill. She tucked the quilt tighter around him, then hummed softly beneath her breath. The boy murmured something in Comanche, soft, unclear. Eleanor leaned closer. "What was that?" "Sweetheart." His tiny hand patted hers. "Enna," he whispered. The word landed in her like a stone dropped into still water. She knew that word. She had heard it before, spoken between siblings, murmured in lullabies. It meant mother, not nursemaid, not stranger, not woman who helped. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She sat there for a long time, the child's fingers curled around hers, her other hand pressed to her chest, trying to steady the trembling beneath her skin. She was not their blood. She was not their story, nor their past. But in that moment, she was something more real than all of that. She kissed the boy's forehead, then sat up slowly and looked around at the other sleeping forms, the girl with the knotted braid, the middle boy who snored through every storm, the eldest who always slept facing the door, all of them breathing deeply, bodies warm beneath woolen hide. Not one had come from her womb, but every single one had begun to grow beneath her hands. Outside, the trees whispered. Inside, her heart whispered back. The sun hung high over the trading post when to tied his horse to the hitch rail and turned to Eleanor. It was market day, noisy, hot, and thick with dust, but they needed salt, bandages, and flour. He had asked her if she wanted to come. He never ordered, never assumed, just asked. She had said yes. They walked side by side, not touching but not apart. Eleanor wore a plain brown dress, her braid tucked beneath a scarf, and the woven basket Ted had given her swung lightly from her elbow. She felt steadier than she had in months, not quite safe, but more like herself. Children ran past them shrieking, waving sticks like swords. Women bartered with sharp voices near the spice stalls. The air smelled of tanned hides and frying lard. It was loud, but familiar. She had just begun to relax when she heard the voice. "Well, look what the wind dragged back." Eleanor turned slowly, standing near the dry goods counter, shaded by a paper parasol. Was her former mother-in-law still wrapped in lace and bitterness? At her side stood a younger woman in a cornflower dress, her belly slightly rounded, gloved fingers resting atop it with calculated grace. The air shifted. The older woman stepped forward, her voice sharp enough to strip bark. "I thought I recognized that hunched little neck." "Mabel, no, Eleanor." She clicked her tongue. Hard to tell under all that dirt and rags. The younger woman giggled, her gaze sliding down Eleanor's dress, over her calloused hands, to her worn basket. "That's her," she asked, loud enough for nearby vendors to hear. "The one who couldn't even produce a squalling pup." "Yes," the elder snapped. "Pretty, but cursed. Useless as a cracked jar. We gave her everything, and she gave us nothing." Eleanor's throat burned. She did not speak. Her feet remained rooted. People had begun to stare. Merchants paused mid-deal. A man chewing tobacco leaned in. Whispers buzzed like nettles against her skin. She clenched the basket tighter and lifted her chin. She would not cry. She had shed enough tears for a lifetime. Then she felt a presence beside her, a quiet shadow that stood tall and unshaken. Too. There was soil on his sleeves, dirt beneath his fingernails. His boots were still damp from the river crossing. He did not speak at first. He simply stood there, still and unmoving. Then, in a voice that cut through every whisper, he said, "She is the only one who made my daughter smile after her mother died." The crowd stilled. Eleanor's breath caught To's gaze didn't move. His voice was not defensive, just solid and true. She knows how to hold fevered children through the night. She hums lullabies in a language not her own. She remembers birthdays no one told her. He turned toward the women. That is worth more than sons born from a woman's belly, but never from her heart. Neither woman replied. The elder's face flushed crimson. The younger woman looked suddenly smaller, her fingers curling around the edge of her dress. To gently touched Eleanor's elbow, not to pull her away, but to ask her if she was ready to go. She nodded, her voice buried beneath the weight in her throat. They walked from the square without another word. No one followed. No one dared. It wasn't until they reached the edge of the woods, their boots muffled by pine needles, that Eleanor's hands began to shake. She stopped, turned to him, her eyes wet and gleaming. No one's ever stood up for me like that, she whispered. Did not speak. He simply looked at her deeply, steadily, then nodded once. That night, when the children were asleep and the fire cast flickering shadows across the lodge walls, Eleanor sat alone outside. In her lap lay a small wildflower she had picked near the stream. She didn't know its name, but it was yellow and stubborn and had bloomed in soil most would call barren. She twirled it between her fingers, tears slipping silently down her cheeks, not from shame, not from fear, but from being defended, from being seen, from knowing that someone had chosen to stand beside her, not because they had to, but because they believed she was worth it. The wind carried the scent of pine and distant rain. The morning they came. 3 riders approached the edge of the Comanche settlement, their boots clean, rifles polished, backs stiff with entitlement. One of them wore a red kerchief at his throat, the same one Eleanor's father had worn the day he tied her to the market post. The 4th rider came more slowly, her former husband. They brought papers stamped, signed, notarized by judge and preacher, legal documents declaring ownership, sealed months before during that shameful transaction. They had come to collect her. Stood between them and the lodge, arms crossed, shoulders square. His children hid behind the door flap. Wide-eyed, Eleanor stood at the threshold, a woven basket still in her hand, a half-cut piece of bread lying on the table behind her. She hadn't known what danger truly looked like until it wore the face of a man who once kissed her with promises. She was sold legally. Her father barked, "She's our blood. We decide where she goes." The man with the kerchief added coldly, "The Comanche have no right to keep a white woman. You'll bring the army down on your heads if you don't comply." To's voice was quiet, but unyielding. "She is not owned. Not here." The riders sneered. "We'll see what the cavalry says about that." That night, the tribal council gathered. Voices low and weary filled the circle like smoke. The elders were clear. Conflict with the white towns would mean blood. Too much had been lost already. They could not afford more. So to said nothing. Eleanor sat outside the council ring, her hands folded tightly in her lap, listening like a child awaiting her sentence. She was to leave by morning. They told her it was for her safety, for peace. She knew it was for survival. They placed her in a separate lean-to, guarded lightly in accordance with the agreement. Her hands were not bound, but the message was unmistakable. Do not resist. Do not run. The children screamed when they heard. Little Ben cried until he made himself sick. The girl clung to Eleanor's leg until the elders pulled her away. Eleanor sat in silence, her eyes dry. There was no dignity left to lose. Until the moon rose. Until the wind shifted. Until she remembered that she was no longer a name on a paper, no longer a trade item on a dusty table, no longer someone whose worth could be weighed in coins or signatures. She stood. She walked to the fire pit, where a broken shard of pottery lay. She picked it up. Inside the lean-to, she pulled the string from her braid and let her hair fall loose, sun-streaked gold, the color they once said was her only worth. She held the shard tightly and raised it to her temple. She cut. Strands fell like silk to the earth. She kept cutting until her neck was bare, until her scalp stung, until the mirror in her mind no longer showed the girl who had once begged to be kept. Then, barefoot and silent, she stepped into the dark. No one saw her go, but the stars did. She passed the goats, the sleeping dogs, the place where the children had made leaf boats. She reached the lodge hers and not hers and opened the flap. To sat inside, knees drawn, eyes closed. He opened them slowly when she entered. She said nothing. At first, he looked at her hair, at her face, at the defiance in the way she stood. "I am not going back," she said. His jaw tensed. "They will come, I know. You might be killed." She nodded. "So be it." He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "Why?" he asked softly. She stepped closer, the night air wrapping around her like a second skin. "Because they bought me with blood," she whispered, her voice steady despite the weight of the truth. "But I will redeem myself with love." He rose, a slow and deliberate motion, as if moved by something sacred. He reached out, hesitated for the barest breath, then placed his hand gently over her heart. It beat steady beneath his touch, no panic, no fear. She was no longer a wife handed off like livestock, no longer a prisoner behind another man's promises, no longer a possession scribbled on a bill of sale. She was a woman who had chosen her own name, and for the first time in her life that name did not echo back to her in pain, but in power. The weeks that followed moved more quietly, but were fuller than any time before. No soldiers arrived, no angry fathers shouting ownership, no husbands demanding their claim. Perhaps the papers had burned, perhaps shame had muzzled them, or perhaps they had come to realize what Eleanor had already known deep in her marrow, that what is rooted in the heart cannot be repossessed. The children returned to her like the tide to the shore. The youngest no longer cried when she stepped out of sight. The girl began bringing her pine cones as gifts, offering them with solemn pride. The second boy began sitting beside her during meals, no longer across the room with wary eyes. Even the eldest, cautious and still watching the door each night, had begun to nod at her words, sometimes even looking directly at her. And slowly, they gave her a new name, not just Enna, but something blooming, something earned. One morning, the middle boy woke from a feverish sleep, turned his flushed face to her, and whispered it like a prayer. Enna rose, Mother rose. Not for the softness of petals, but for the strength of thorns, for the warmth she offered without condition, for the steadfastness that had grown around them like a fortress made of kindness. She began to teach them letters, drawing shapes in dust with charcoal, etching their names on worn bark and river stones. She hummed as she wrote, her voice a low current of comfort. She showed them how to spell their names, and then, gently, beneath each one, she added her own, Rose. It was the first time she'd ever written it like that, not as a leftover surname, not as something inherited or abandoned, but as something whole. Eleanor also taught them songs, soft hymns her mother once sang while folding laundry, half-forgotten ballads, lullabies in both English and her halting Comanche. The children listened, then joined in, voices hesitant at first, then strong. The forest around them seemed to lean in, listening to never interrupted. He would sometimes stand in the doorway, arms folded, still as stone, but with a softness in his eyes that never left her. Other times, he left quiet offerings beside her, work gifts she never asked for, a new quill fashioned from a hawk feather, a jar of tart berries, a river stone polished smooth by time. One crisp morning, Eleanor walked beside two and the eldest boy, Tama, toward the schoolhouse on the edge of a nearby town. A teacher from the east had arrived, offering to register children for learning, regardless of tribe, so long as they knew some English. Tama clung to her hand, his grip tight, nervous, as they stepped into the creaky-floored room with its chalk-scratched walls. The teacher, a tall man with gold-rimmed glasses and an air of practiced politeness, looked up from his register. "Name of the child?" he asked, pen poised. "Tama," the boy said. Full name. Tama hesitated, then looked to Eleanor. Wide-eyed, she gave a soft, encouraging nod. "Tama rose too," he said, the words clear and unwavering. The teacher blinked. "And your mother's name?" There was a pause. Eleanor opened her mouth, but Tama spoke first. "Eleanor Tucho," he said, voice proud, "because that's the name I call her from my heart." The teacher stared first at the boy, then at her. Then he nodded, no further questions, and wrote it down. They walked back through the trees in silence, the boy swinging her hand as if the world had never been cruel. The forest seemed brighter, the wind softer. She didn't cry, but her chest ached in the best possible way. That night, she sat by the fire and wrote the name on a piece of bark, Eleanor too. Not granted by law, not stamped by birth, but chosen, earned, loved. The sky cracked, but never wept. The sun loomed high over the land like judgment. Day after day, it drained the rivers into brittle ribbons and turned the soil to powder. Trees wilted, their leaves curled like dried parchment. The corn died first, then the beans, then the wildflowers she had coaxed to life at the edge of the garden. The drought settled in like grief, but Eleanor rose before dawn each morning, her breath fogging in the faintest chill. She filled pots, buckets, tin cans with water from the deep well. Her hands blistered, her back ached. Still, she moved through the rows, plant by plant, whispering to them like frightened children. She sang lullabies once meant for fevered babies. Her voice did not crack. The garden did not bloom. But it did not die. Not while she loved it. To watched. From the porch, slower now, more worn. Dust clung to his steps, to the curve of his shoulders. He worked longer on less food. Even strong men can wilt beneath too much sun. One evening, she found him collapsed near the woodshed. His skin burned hot beneath her palm. Just tired, he murmured, but she saw the truth in his eyes. She did not sleep for 2 nights. She brewed herbs, wiped sweat from his face, held him through shivers. Spoon by spoon, she fed him broth, whispering, past his muttered curses. Do not leave me, he said once in a fever-drenched haze. I will not, she answered softly. Not now, not here. When he finally woke, the light filtering through the slats was soft and kind. He blinked at her tangled hair, her sleepless eyes. You look like hell, he rasped. She smiled. You should see yourself. That same day, the first green shoot broke through the garden's cracked skin. A week later, a yellow bloom opened near the fence. Then another, then another. The children called it a miracle. Eleanor called it grace. To stood beside her, watching a tomato cling to its vine like a quiet promise. How? He asked. You taught me not everything worth keeping comes easy, she said. He nodded, took her hand, and kissed each knuckle with a reverence words could not hold. That evening, they drove a wooden sign into the dry earth at the gardens. Edge. Not for sale. Not the land, not the home, not the love built from dust and held together with blistered hands. Years passed. The children grew, married, returned with children of their own. Grandchildren ran barefoot between rows Eleanor had once watered by the spoonful. They called her Enna Rose. When knees scraped or thunder rolled, they ran to her without thinking. To aged like oak, slow, quiet, solid. He carved toys, built benches, spoke little, listened much. When asked how he knew Eleanor was the one, he always answered the same. She stayed. One crisp morning, they sat on the porch together, fingers intertwined. I was once told I was worthless because I could not carry blood, she said softly. He turned to her, eyes warm and full of memory. You carried a home, he said. A family, a man who didn't know how to begin until you. She leaned her head against his shoulder. I wasn't the start of your bloodline. No, he whispered. But you were where I ended in peace when Eleanor passed. They buried her beneath the tree in the garden, where wind chimes still whispered her songs. To carve her stone himself, asterisk. She did not birth us, but she raised all that we became, asterisk. He sat by her grave every morning, until one morning, he didn't come. They buried him beside her. The garden never stopped blooming, even in the driest years. It remembered her hands. Travelers still pass the old fence and see the faded sign, asterisk. Not for sale, asterisk, because some things are too deeply loved to ever be owned. And love, once rooted, grows forever. If this story stirred something quiet and true in your chest, if Eleanor's strength reminded you that love isn't measured in blood but in how fiercely we choose to stay, then you are exactly where you belong. At asterisk Wild West Love Stories, asterisk, we bring you tales of grit, grace, and devotion in the untamed heart of frontier America. Stories where bullets missed, but hearts didn't. Where women like Eleanor weren't just survivors, they were the soul of homes that never existed until they built them. So if you believe in love that grows through drought, in families formed By choice, not just blood. And in stories that make you cry softly and smile even softer, subscribe. Hit the bell and ride with us into the wild dot, because out here, love is never easy, but it is always worth it.